Wallimann-Helmer. Since 2018, he has been Professor of Environmental Humanities at the University of Fribourg, and since 2019, the Director of the University of Fribourg's Environmental Sciences and Humanities Institute. The core areas of his work investigate conceptual and normative issues of justice in climate action and environmental protection, technological innovation for sustainability, and the fair differentiation of responsibilities in environmental practice, and most recently, food systems. His key interest concerns the conceptual conflicts between the global and intergenerational dimensions of these challenges and the local information about his current projects. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now listen to the discussion on justice in renewable energy transitions by Professor Ivo Wallimann-Helmer. A warm
Excellent.
round of
Thank you very
applause,
much.
please.
Could anyone give me a right to share my screen? I have some slides, and it seems not be possible at the moment.
No, I, Professor. We'll try to fix the.
Yeah.
Can you try now?
Yes, excellent. Okay. Give me a second, please. Good. So, okay. I talk about justice in renewable energy transitions, and I just want to mention some aspects I take to be important if you talk about reducing emissions in climate mitigation. And I mean, in this context, I don't need to say too much about this. So we see that emissions are increasing. We see maybe even a correlation between emission rise and economic development. And it's also clear that there's a lot of emissions that we produce are linked to energy production. And that means when we talk about emission reductions, we also need to change our energy production. That means we need to go in direction of renewable energy. I think we also need to talk about nuclear energy maybe, and what we importantly need to talk about is carbon dioxide removal. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of any specific way of how we need to produce energy, but if it's about reducing emissions, we need to consider these technologies because they will remain important if we want to reduce emissions in energy production. Here is a short overview of what I want to do or what I would like to do. So I will talk about climate change and reducing energy emissions. I will be talking about justice issues, mention some, and then finally I will talk about procedural justice and issues of recognition that we need to consider because fairness for technological reasons, fairness in energy transitions is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. So let me start talking about climate change and reducing energy emissions. It's clear. So we have here. This is the kind of how climate change works, and you see you have the different policy areas. And my discussion before was talking a lot also about climate adaptation. I only focus on this part here, so emission production in energy production. And I will also concentrate on CDR because issues of justice that are relevant with regard to reducing emissions in emission production also concern this geoengineering technology I will be talking about shortly. So the issues are quite similar, and they rely on a huge debate that is called the debate about environmental justice. That concerns the distribution of burdens between different human beings concerned. I start with a iconic, maybe a bit a provocative example, nuclear power. nuclear power is an energy with long-lasting negative impacts, but at the same time, we could say it's an energy that does not produce emissions. But it's clear if you talk about such a facility that we have an unequal distribution of risks that concern those living nearby. We have noise that is produced simply because we have a facility. We need land there. And for sure, those who live close by such a facility face bigger risks of accidental harm. This could also be said of other technologies, right? So if you talk about dams, for example, or if you talk about producing new renewable energy with solar panels or wind turbines, we could also say we have there an unequal distribution of burdens, maybe not so heavy. They change in their nature and in how long-lasting they are, but we have this unequal distribution. And in addition, if you look at these examples here, we need land to realize these facilities or these ways of producing renewable energy. We might need water, and the conflict we have, there's a conflict of interest because wherever we need land to produce energy and it's not available anymore for producing food, for example, we have potential conflict with food security, or if you need water, we have a potential conflict with water consumption or water needs. And furthermore, if we consider the impacts of such kind of new ways of producing energy on nature, we might also have conflicts with biodiversity. And all that together leads to issues that can be expressed as conflicts between different SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, because if you want to protect nature, for example, life on land, and we have a dam that destroys life on land, we might be able to fight climate change, so SDG climate action, but we have then a conflict with sustaining life on land, for example. Now, the last issue that is also relevant concerns negative emission technologies or carbon dioxide removal technologies. I want to mention them not because they are the most important to produce energy in the future, but simply because we need these technologies according to different IPCC reports, because the targets of the Paris Agreement won't be possible to be achieved without such technologies. And the one most discussed, or the two most discussed, are reforestation here, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That is a technology that grows biomass, burns the biomass, extracts the CO2 from the stream, and then liquefies CO2 and stores it on the ground. The idea here is to produce so-called negative emissions. So we take out more emissions from the atmosphere than we produce. And the thing is, talking about these technologies also means that we need to talk about the issues that I just mentioned, because these facilities will also be at a certain place. We need land to grow biomass that is not available anymore for food production. We need to produce this biomass by using a lot of water that is also not available anymore. So we have similar conflicts around there. And the models assume that we upscale these technologies to a large amount. Furthermore, and in addition to all these risks, we also have a risk of postponing the potential failure of these technologies to the future, because even though these technologies are already tested, no one really knows how to upscale these technologies to the amount that it is assumed in these different IPCC reports. So overall, we have these justice issues if we talk about decarbonization. So we can say we start with the lowest. We have an unequal distribution of burdens with all the different ways of producing energy. They concern health risks of accidental harm. We have an issue with noise when operating these facilities. We have a conflict of interest that concerns different interests of human beings, but also of non-human nature. And finally, we also have a kind of an intergenerational issue, at least with these CDR technologies, because it is assumed we can achieve the goals with these technologies, but we don't know how to upscale. And we could also say, if we talk about other ways of producing renewable energy, we have similar risks because, let's say, with the solar panels, they have never been used to produce all the electricity we need globally. So we have a similar issue. So these are justice issues, and the question then is, how shall we solve them? So that's what I want to talk about now. And if you talk about justice issues, I would say we can rely back on Aristotle and on the principle that I call here formal equality, the principle that says equals must be treated equally and unequals must be treated unequally. What means if we have good reasons to distribute unequally, we can then justify an unequal distribution. If we talk about environmental justice, this is often the question of the distribution of risks. And the challenge is always to justify if risks are unequally distributed. If they're equally distributed according to these principles, we assume it's okay that we have the distribution we have because it's a fair distribution. However, if this distribution is not equal, we need a justification. This is a concern of outcome justice or distributive justice, and concerns the question what distribution is fair. And if we consider my issues of justice I just mentioned, we can ask what could be reasons to justify such an unequal distribution we have there. And I will make some suggestions shortly with normative principles. What definitely should play a role if we talk about an unequal distribution is geographical proximity to these facilities, right? We could also say the nature of these facilities and involved risks matter. So it makes a difference whether we talk about solar panels or whether we talk about nuclear energy production, right? Different risks. And also the durability and severity of impacts should play a role when we assess what distribution of impacts of new renewable energy production or new less emission-intensive energy production is fair. What definitely should not play any role is differences in ethnicity, because ethnicity is in no way relevant with regard to the distribution of or unequal distribution of burdens when it comes to energy production. Similarly, we could also say social and economic disadvantage should not become relevant here, and also the fact that if you are more vulnerable, that you risk more quickly to become ill. The social determinants of health should not also play any role. In environmental justice debate, what is usually said is if you have an unequal distribution that correlates with socioeconomic disadvantage or ethnicity, that we have a problematic distribution of environmental risks, and it is argued this is an injustice. However, the question for me is always, is this really an injustice simply because we have such a correlation? Because we could at least consider that more exposure is also due to, let's say, responsible choice, for example, and responsible choice might justify an inequality. And it's also maybe the case that we have a correlation with socioeconomic inequalities, but it's the rich that face more environmental burdens. And the question then would be, shouldn't we just accept this inequality? Now, if we look at principles of justice, here are some ways of how we could try to justify an unequal distribution of risks in energy production or burdens in energy production. The first one is simple. It says there's no reason to unequally distribute these risks, right? So there are no criteria that justifies something like that. The most obvious one, and my pre-speaker already mentioned it, would be the polluter pays principle. We say, yes, we distribute the burdens with regard to energy production in relation to how much you contribute to the use of this energy or how much you benefit. That would be the next principle. So it's proportional to how much energy you consume or how much you benefit from others producing emissions and producing this energy for you. And then we distribute proportionally to that. So the more energy you consume, the more you should be burdened by these facilities. And finally, there's also another principle that is called ability to pay principle that I take to be quite challenging or not appropriate. that would be the principle to say we just have or distribute the burdens according to the capacity to accept these risks. I would not consider this as a relevant principle because there's a big risk of unfairness here, because only if people accept implicitly it seems that they accept to take more risks, and that seems like being capable of accepting more risk does not mean that this is really explicit acceptance. It's rather a risk that we disadvantage those that are already disadvantaged. But it could still be discussed if we talk about technology. Now, with the other principles, especially if you think of nuclear power plants, we also have issues with all these technologies in the end, because for efficiency reasons, it's more or better to have centralized facilities and not just distribute them all over the country. Because, for example, the polluter pays principle would demand that we store in each and every backyard the nuclear waste you produce by your energy consumption, and that seems not to be possible for efficiency reasons, but also for security reasons. We need some geological conditions for storing nuclear waste, so we cannot distribute it even equally or according to benefit. And finally, it's also technologically quite difficult. So that's, as just mentioned, that with regard to nuclear power, but that's also true if you want to have wind turbines. It's also true if you talk about these BECCS facilities that I mentioned before. So for efficiency, security, and technological reasons, it's simply not possible to realize justice. So justice according to equality or justice according to the polluter pays or beneficiary pays principle. And that's, I think, is the big challenge we face if we talk about the fair distribution of burdens when we talk about energy transitions. So we face a challenge, an efficiency, security, and technological challenge to realize justice. And the question is, what shall we do? My proposal would be we should rely on procedural justice and recognition. But these are two other ways of how to look at justice. Procedural justice, or procedural involvement, as I like to call it, asks not only to discuss the outcome distribution, but rather to involve those concerns in the decisions about how to distribute burdens or benefits. And justice as recognition asks we should involve all minorities, indigenous peoples, weak members of society, more generally speaking, in the decision making. And it asks under what conditions is recognition appropriate? What does it mean to have everyone involved in the procedures of decision making on the fair terms? And in my view, this would be the solution to the problem we have, that it's not possible for security, technological reasons, and efficiency reasons to realize justice. We should rely on procedural involvement and make sure that we have conditions of recognition justice fulfilled. A reason for that is clear. Exposing someone to higher risks is difficult to justify if they had no chance to consent or to at least be involved in the decision making. So that would be a justification in favor of procedural justice. We can diminish an injustice if we involve those concerned in the decision making, if they could have a say. It's also possible to important to involve those concerned in the decision making about risks, because a risk assessment is a value assessment, and that's only partly possible based on scientific grounds. On the other side, it's always the assessment of those concerned, whether a risk is acceptable or tolerable or intolerable. And in that way, we need to involve those concerned, but can at least diminish the injustice if they could have had a say in how they assess the injustice they face. This is also, and even more important, if you talk about the compensation for higher burdens and risks. Here also, I think it's important to demand those affected to participate here. Because if you have a decline in your way of life, quality of life, because you face higher risks or more noise or whatever, it's only those concerned that can really say in what way they are impacted by these additional risks and what fair compensation would mean for them. So in that sense, involving those concerned also means to diminish injustice. The problem with all that is with procedural justice or procedural involvement, involving those concerned in decision making, we do not produce justice. We can only legitimize unfair decisions or an unfair distribution of the distribution of burdens with regard to energy production. And the reason for this is, again, if you go back to my principles of justice that I mentioned, that these are not possible to be realized due to technological security and efficiency reasons. But at least to legitimize such an unfair distribution of burdens is an improvement, I would say, even though it's not leading to justice. If we talk about procedural justice, we have some challenges of recognition that we need to recognize as well, because in order to make everyone participate in such procedures, we not only need to make formally sure that we have everyone involved on equal terms, we also need to make sure that everyone has an equal possibility to be involved, or that we realize what I call substantial equality. Because simply giving everyone the possibility to vote does not mean that they have the same power to make their voices heard. What we need, at least to make sure for this, is some education, appropriate information, and for sure also fair distribution of economic resources, because without such a fair distribution of resources, those concerned might not be able to go for their interests and push their interests on an equal footing with those that have more economic power. So that's a challenge of recognition we have. And on the other side, that's another challenge of recognition we face. If we accept that those concerned should have a voice in this decision making, then we might have a big challenge of whom to involve in such a decision making. So we need to define the body of the decision-making body in such concerns, and that might be challenging as well. So, for example, in Switzerland, we have some, or France has some nuclear energy plants quite close to the Swiss border, and we will be affected if there's a negative impact with regard to these facilities. But that would mean Swiss people should have a right to vote on what is appropriate compensation for the fact that in France there are some nuclear power plants. And that would be quite radical, because that would mean you would need to change the demos deciding on such issues. And if we consider all the different issues we face with regard to renewable energy production globally in order for decarbonization, we see that this is also quite a radical idea, because it means, depending on the facility we are talking about, we need to change those involved in decision making. And this is not the way we usually think about state borders, the definition of the citizen body to change, to decide about political issues. So on one side, we need to make sure substantial equality of all those concerned. On the other side, there's the challenge of defining who should be involved in the decision making. However, still, I believe this is what we can achieve with regard to renewable energy transitions. We have all these justice issues. We need to discuss them, but for technical security and efficiency reasons, it's difficult to realize principles of justice, the principle of justice that I suggested, to distribute burdens unequally but on fair grounds. And that's why I think procedural justice is the way to go, or fair procedures in decision making will become or must become crucial here. However, they cannot justify the distribution as just, but just only legitimize the decisions that we are taking with regard to unequal distribution of the burdens coming with renewable energy transitions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Helmer. Our floor is now open for questions and reflections.
So at the moment, I don't hear anything. Okay, we start.
We have
Good.
from our online participants.
You're still muted.
Good afternoon. Am I audible on the other end?
Yes, now I hear you.
Here's a question from our online participant. Indigenous peoples are our primary dialogue partners in the care for the earth as mentioned in Laudato Si. The question is, to what extent are indigenous peoples granted a voice and actively engaged in addressing environmental challenges in your country?
I think so. The context of Switzerland is maybe a bit different because we have direct democracy. That means in most policy decisions, everyone is involved. For example, if it's about an energy production plant that concerns some state or even some city or smaller community, they will be involved in decision making. The challenge is that the borders of the citizens that decide on these issues, they are fixed and not relative to the different facilities we talk about. The other thing that is different in Switzerland, I would say it's difficult to say we have indigenous peoples that might have difficulties to access policy decisions, because indigenous are all those that live in a certain city or a certain community, and they have a right to vote there. So they are involved in the decision making anyhow.
Thank you very much, Professor. Other questions? Or reflections?
We have one online.
There's another one online.
Yes, thank you, Ivo, for your, I would say, disturbing contribution. And I would like to say one thing first. I'm from Germany and teaching in Switzerland. I'm deeply convinced that the solution for many of our problems concerning democracy lie in Switzerland. Direct democracy changes the whole game, and it's interesting and disturbing as well. But I would like to raise one question to Ivo. It's not easy to hear that you can't create justice, but only, well, deal with injustice and find a fair solution. For me, the difficult question is, what's about conflicts? What's about if groups have differences in their strength? What do you do with unequal situation of power if you need a fair solution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this was my last slide on the left, where I was talking about a challenge of recognition. Because, you could say if you have procedures for decision making, we just need to involve everyone and say you have a right to be involved here and go for it. So you invest in the decision making. I argue this is not enough. We need to make sure that we have maybe not equal power, but on a minimal level, equal power for everyone involved. And I'm leaving that in a way open. But what I mentioned is we need appropriate information for everyone. We need certain education so that you can understand the information. And also we need a fair distribution of financial resources so that all those that want to voice their interests have a chance to make them heard. And These substantial conditions, I think, are really crucial, and they are also often overlooked when we talk about procedural justice and involvement in decision making. And especially if you talk about indigenous peoples, not in Switzerland, but in other countries that have really difficulties to make themselves heard, that's a crucial issue. And that's also why I argue in several contexts, if we talk about procedural justice, rather than directly investing in environmental measures, it is more important to first invest in institutions, stable institutions, and the education of people so that they then can voice their beliefs on fair grounds, right? So that's why I think this talk about institutionalization is crucial and the first step before we just jump in and go there and say, yes, here are the measures you need to take. I think stable institutions and institutions that ensure fair conditions for everyone to be involved are crucial.
Thank you very much, Professor. A round of applause for our final discussant. At this juncture, we would like to invite to the online floor, once again, all our panel of speakers, Professor Father Hans Ulrich Stemans, OP,
Yeah, I'll remind them.
Professor Father Dokun Oyeshola, OP, and Professor Ivo Wallimann-Helmer, as well as Professor Helmut Zander for our final open forum. So at this point, anyone can raise questions to any of our discussants, and the discussants may also raise questions amongst themselves. There's a question from Mr. Tadeo.
Sorry, Leo, you have been muted during the first sentences of your contribution. Could you perhaps repeat your first sentences?
There was no contribution, Professor. I only called you by name, so you did not miss anything. Thank you. But there's a question here from Mr. Tadeo, and that might keep us on track.
This is not actually a question, but just a support statement to what Professor Sanders said a while ago regarding justice, climate justice. Now, this is in reference to the power play that's in place right now in the world with regard to climate, to environmental ethics also. Now, one of the things that's very glaring was when the Kyoto Protocol was implemented in 1997, which ran until 2015, China and the United States did not sign. Now, part of the provision of the Kyoto Protocol was to reduce carbon emissions, but then the United States and China did not sign that because they were the primary producers of products that would produce carbon footprints in the world. And another thing that I'd like to comment on was here in the Philippines, the power play that's at play right now in the world is the third world countries are not that educated regarding this climate ethics. And part of that is we in the Philippines, we receive all the garbage from Canada, and it's only in 2018 and to 2019 that President Duterte called Canada to get back all their garbages that were dumped here in the Philippines. So I think as first world people, what do you think can this contribute to the education of us in the third world developing countries with regard to climate ethics? Thank you.
Yes, Professor Ivo.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think on one side is a similar response to what I gave before, right? So I think I fully agree we have this power relation issue or this power play, and it means that we need to make sure that everyone can contribute to political debates on an equal footing. So that's one thing. We could also say that's a classical. So the example you mentioned about the waste is a classical example of an unfair burden sharing, right? Canada produces the waste and it comes then to you. That's definitely not fair, and it means they should at least get it back and then see how they can distribute it in their own country. So I would say something like the polluter pays principle or the beneficiary pays principle plays into here and can help explain why we have an unfairness here.
Other questions? I have a question myself, if you would indulge. How would you assess Pope Francis's two documents, Laudato Si and Laudate Deum now, in terms of being anthropocentric? Of course, as Sir Joel said this morning, the word anthropocentrism is almost always used in these documents with a qualifier. But then again, in terms of his stand, would you assess Pope Francis to be anthropocentric? Has he transitioned already in the second document, Laudate Deum, or is he still very much in line with the usual, or if you may even call it usual, stance in terms of the position of man vis-a-vis the rest of creation?
We missed the first lines, Sir Leo. To whom is the question addressed?
I would like to address the question to our speakers, whoever is willing to answer. In terms of his documents and also his overall stance as in his pronouncements as Pope, how would you assess Francis, particularly in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum? Is his stance more anthropocentric in the traditional sense, or is he now transitioning towards perhaps a more nuanced anthropocentrism, or how would you assess more or less his stance vis-a-vis the position of man in relation to the rest of creation?
Let me answer this question because I have addressed this issue already in several presentations I gave. Laudato Si is still rather anthropocentric, and that was due to the aim of Laudato Si, which was addressed to the politicians or the Catholics. And of course, Catholic politicians who want to be elected by Catholics, especially also Obama, in the preparation of the summit, Paris summit in 2015. So in order to at least show those politicians, if they give a commitment at the climate summit in Paris, they will have the Catholic population not against them, because the Pope is in favor for such a commitment as it was expressed in Laudato Si. So, and due to this political aim, I think he was very much anthropocentric, because he had to show how those commitments to a more sustainable lifestyle would also benefit to humans. So he could not just address ethical questions or biocentric questions in general. On the other hand, in Querida Amazonia already, he changes to a bit more biocentric aspects, giving in chapter 54 of Querida Amazonia, he says explicitly that every life form has an intrinsic value. And I think it's the first time that official doctrine of the church says that. So it's Querida Amazonica 54. And this is also due to the adaptation of in Querida Amazonia of this idea of buen vivir, which is a key term of indigenous people in Colombia, and it is very much biocentristic. So by taking up buen vivir as his red line in Querida Amazonia, he is actually inclining to biocentrism.
I think I'm cut off. Thank you, Father Steymans. I'm not sure, but I think the Pope was quoting himself in Querida Amazonia, because I remember that's my favorite part of Laudato Si. Laudato Si 33. The talk of the intrinsic
that's
right.
true. He quotes himself, Laudato Si, but there is a sentence before. And this sentence before, where he actually says that now it has always been taught that every living being has an intrinsic value. This has not actually always been told. This is the new sentence that is before the quotation.
Oh, the first one. Yes, that's right. Thank you, Father. I like that part too. That's why I remember it very much. Other questions, or perhaps Sir Ivo, please.
Sir Leo,
Professor.
yeah, probably you give seconds before you start to talk in your transition from the online to the on-site audio. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Professor Ivo.
So I didn't hear the. Oh, you asked me to respond to the question, you mean? Because, I mean, I'm not an expert in Laudato Si, but couldn't one say, so there's a distinction between weak and strong anthropocentrism. And strong anthropocentrism is simply, it's only human beings that are at the center. And weak anthropocentrism says, no, it's if human beings know well or are rational, they can also see that or even define that nature has intrinsic value. And would it be possible to say that in Laudato Si we have a weak anthropocentrism? So that's more a question to Ulrich than I'm an expert, but I just wondered whether that could help also to see why we have these different positions involved. Oh, that's
Father.
good. So Ulrich.
That's true. That's true. You could call it a weak anthropocentrism because he actually addresses a too harsh anthropocentrism and the exploitation. Yeah, exactly right.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Father, many of the audience here, our on-site audience here, reacted when you said that the church at the time when ecotheology was still starting was somehow sleeping. Would you say that the church has now awakened, or maybe still dozing off, snoozing the alarm? How would you assess our, as it were, growth or progress in terms of our awareness and involvement in the environmental crisis?
Right. Yes, the church woke up together with much of the community in the 80s, when the environmental issues became once, for the first time, really worldwide a problem, or were realized worldwide. Worldwide. It started with the Green Movement, which was actually founded in Tasmania, and was very strong in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s in Australia. And then in the 90s came a backslash because the lobbies of the fossil energy and other political forces made a huge propaganda to draw this, to pull this environmental concern that started in the 80s with the founding of the Green parties all over the world. They pushed it back. And so in the 90s, we got a backslash. And the church, the Catholic Church, got it for the first time in some talks by John Paul II, and then not so much outspoken, but more in a practical way under Benedict XVI, who, for example, established solar panels on the audience hall of the Vatican, and so he did it more by doing and not so much by teaching, because when he was the head of the dicasterium of the Catholic faith, he was very much persecuting ecological scholars like Prof, like Matthew Fox, a Dominican, for example. So he did not change his mind officially and outspokenly, but he did it a bit in the way he governed the Vatican. And then you have the big alarm clock for awakening the Catholic Church with Francis. Because I think that actually choosing the name Francis is already an answer to Lynn White's accusation of the Catholic, of the Christian faith, and especially the Western Christian way of dealing with the nature. And Lynn White named St. Francis as the one great exemption of a Western medieval attitude to nature. And so by taking up that name, and then from then onwards, putting that really on the agenda, Francis is the alarm clock to wake us up. And by joining the environmental concern of the Patriarch of Constantinople.
Thank you very much, Father. We give way to Professor Helmut for his intervention.
If I'm looking back on our three contributions, if I understood Arlen quite well, she said, well, we have to change our conscience. If I look on Ivo, he says we have to create institutions. And if I look on Dokun, you say, well, the regulations in Nigeria, the laws are quite well, but corruption is a problem. But then I have the question, do we have the time to, well, change our minds, change our institutions, and to fight corruption? Perhaps it's not a question, but it's a statement, and I don't know what to do. But I think with regard to many things, we don't have the time to establish all these changes. And so I would like to ask our participants, what can we do? What shall we do with a quite short perspective, a quite short timeline?
Anyone from our discussants can... Father Yeshua, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Mine is not a recommendation at this point in time, but rather an addition to what Father Sander has already asked. If the church is now awake in relation to ecology, environmental ecology, theological ecology, the issue of climate change and justice, we in the developing countries, as far as the Catholic Church is concerned, are still yet to see the manifestation of this new awakening. How can we see more of the demonstration that the church in the West is seriously concerned about ways and means by which we have to address climate change and its challenges, particularly knowing that we are all in a common boat. And if the boat should subside and capsize, all of us are going to pay for it. So this is my concern. I'm just saying, in what way can the church be more manifest to the people in the developing countries to demonstrate that definitely the church is really concerned? So this is my query. What can we do about this?
Professor Helmer?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not having a full response, but what I think is important wherever we are, that there are two different kinds of responsibilities. Namely, one is our individual responsibility to change our lifestyles. And for sure, everyone in the West needs to change their lifestyles quite a lot, right? But that's only part of our responsibility, and it only concerns the part of our lives where we talk about luxury. And in the West, we talk a lot about luxury, so we can change our lifestyles, reduce emissions. And then there's another important part that is political. At some point, we need to become political and try to change these institutions. And that's the other part where, or let's say, we also need to engage in education and so on, so to make people change their beliefs about the environment and climate and try to change their lifestyles individually. So that's the part where it becomes more institutional. But then Helmut would object to this suggestion, we don't have the time. And a recent paper says, yes, we might not have the time, but if we don't act now, we have a new risk, namely that we need authoritarian regimes to overcome the environmental crisis we face. And the paper says this is not an argument for authoritarianism, but it's a warning. So maybe that helps. To not have this risk, we should act now. Otherwise, we risk that at some point we need authoritarian regimes, and that's something we don't want to. So maybe that's an additional motivation to act now. It's not a solution, but even more showing we have to go forward. Otherwise, we risk a world we don't want to.
Thank you, Professor. At this moment, maybe we can invite our speakers to impart to our audiences, both on-site and online, some of their parting thoughts and final words. Any volunteer to start?
I
Yes,
can give it
Professor.
a try.
Thank you.
So I think what is important, with these kinds of discussions, you always finish in the negative or with a lot of conflicts and a lot of issues and what shall we do? But for me, it's it's always being hopeful or having the faith of saying, you know, all what we do here is at least to inform, to educate, to provide further competencies to finally then deal with the issues we face. And if you lose that hope and just look at it in the negative, we won't be able to act as well. So that's why I think it's really important to remain somehow positive in the area where we are, and hope and try to change things, you know, in the direction we think it needs to go. So we should not lose hope. Maybe that's the most important conclusion for me.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Would someone else like to share their... All right. Thank you very much to our dear speakers. Shall we have a round of applause again for our discussions? There's a motion from Professor Zander. Yes, Professor.
For me, it's always intriguing to realize that we have very different problems and very different options in different countries and different regions of the world. And I always realize how less I understand about different options and different claims what to do. I consider it, that's another point for me, quite helpful to realize that high norms of justice are very problematic to achieve. And I appreciate very much Ivo's attempt to say that the balance of interests and the creation of justice begins quite early. Not in the questions of how to deal with differences in power play, but that we have a bit to change the system in which we think and the institutions we are working in. Perhaps I'm contradicting myself, because indeed I think we don't have the time, but we have the chance to change our minds, to change our intellectual tools to deal with these things. And I would say, concerning my experience in the university, all the speakers, including myself and the younger ones, we are a bit old school. For many students, the problem is really burning, and they are not willing to accept our discussions on how to proceed if we don't if we don't react and do something. In this perspective, I share Ivo's perspective that the people are willing to do something and to accept burdens, I would say, in the younger generation, that my generation is not really willing to accept. So in this perspective, there is a change in the mentalities, which is perhaps not present in our critical debates, but which is, if I listen correctly to my students, to our students, there's a change which is going on, which gives a quite positive perspective, at least on the willingness to change these things and to accept burdens.
Thank you very much for those thoughts, Professor Zander. Indeed, as we said at the beginning of this afternoon symposium, we don't really have to leave with answers. What's important is we're able to surface concerns and the different layers that those concerns of ours about the environment have at this point in history. Indeed, it may be a question of having no more time, but it's also a question of having to do, it has to do with what we do with the time, whatever little time that we have. So thank you very much to our dear discussants. A round of applause, please. Please allow me to read the certificate of appreciation, which will be given to each of them. The Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, the Catholic University of the Philippines, awards the certificate of appreciation to, for sharing his time and expertise as a speaker on the topic during the Salixican and 10th Leonardo Legaspi OP lectures with the theme Cultivating Global Citizenship within the Framework of Caring for Creation on Monday, 13th of November 2023 at the University of Santo Tomas, Manila, Philippines. Given this 13th day of November in the year of our Lord, 2023 at the University of Santo Tomas, Manila, Philippines. Each certificate is signed by Reverend Father Ermito G. Disagon OP, SSL, Director, Institute of Religion, University of Santo Tomas, and Professor Joel Sagot, PhD, Director, Center for Theology, Religious Studies and Ethics, University of Santo Tomas. A virtual round of applause again for each of our speakers. Professor Father Hans Ulrich Steimans, OP, Professor Arlen Ancheta, PhD, Professor Father Dokon Oyeshola, OP, and Professor Ivo Wallimann-Helmer. To receive a certificate of participation, kindly complete the evaluation form. The QR code is flashed on screen and the link will be posted in the chat box for the benefit of our Zoom participants. At this point, may we invite everyone for a short photo opportunity. So this will be both online and through Zoom. So our dear speakers, please keep your cameras turned on. Sorry, we will return to the QR code later, but shall we first have a photo opportunity with our speakers? Yeah, for our on-site participants, although you may be small in the picture, but yeah, I think you can still be seen substantially. Kindly congregate to the center of the venue, please. We also request the online participants to turn on their cameras if they're able to. One, ready, smile. One more, and one last. Thank you very much, and we hope that you had a meaningful and fruitful day with us. We thank you all for your participation and we look forward to more conversations with you in our future conferences. God bless us all.